Hello everyone, welcome to the introduction to SharePoint Webhooks. This webcast will give you an overview of what SharePoint Webhooks are and how you can leverage them in your SharePoint developments. With me today I have Vesa Juvonen. Vesa, can you please introduce?
Absolutely. So my name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a senior program manager from Office 365, or SharePoint engineering to be precise. And I'll be your Bert's lovely assistant today asking random questions.
Oh, hopefully not too difficult questions, Vesa. So I'm Bert. I'm a service engineer inside Microsoft. So going on, let's quickly talk about what is PnP.
Yeah, so let me do it quickly, this slide. Just to explain for those who might have watched these videos for the first time, SharePoint PnP is an engineering-driven community initiative where we work together with community MVPs and non-MVPs to provide code samples, guidance documentations, monthly community calls and other community calls, and case studies. We have them as well. The themes are in SharePoint Framework, which is the new shiny thing, going to GA relatively soon while we're recording this video, and then obviously SharePoint add-ins, remote APIs in general, Microsoft Graph, Office 365 APIs. The guidance applies for both SharePoint online and on premises for the, well, whatever is actually supported in on premises as an example. As a good example is SharePoint Framework, first going to be released in SharePoint Online, then it's going to land on SharePoint 2016, later on 2017. AKMS, SharePoint PnP is the one address to remember. You find all of the webcast, all of the other stuff from there. But let's actually jump on today's topic, and I'll let Bert lead the discussion, and I'll jump in whenever needed.
Thank you, Vesa. So what are webhooks actually? Now, you can see webhooks as a way for SharePoint to notify you of a particular change. So let's give an example. If you upload a document to a library and you would have a webhook on that particular library, SharePoint would notify you like, hey, something happened on your library. It's a push model, so SharePoint pushes a notification to you, and it is an asynchronous model. So we're not supporting the item adding events for the classic SharePoint guys. So it's always an after the fact event that happens.
And that's actually a good point to remember. So you cannot use a webhook to cancel an operation. You get a notification that operation has completed. That's really the key point.
Yes, yes. Now, webhooks is not something that the SharePoint team invented or that the Office 365 team invented. Essentially, webhooks is a universal model used by many cloud providers. WordPress is using it, GitHub is using it a lot, MailChimp, etc. So we're just using what's common in the industry today. And the good thing now is that webhooks are released to production as of January 2017 for SharePoint lists. So current implementation only supporting events happening on the SharePoint list.
Sure. And additional support is coming at some point, and we'll absolutely make announcements on those as well.
Okay, so the following slides will show you how to subscribe to a webhook and then what happens when a webhook fires and how to handle that. So let's first start with subscribing to a webhook. What you need to do. At first, your application will need to make the subscription. Essentially, that means we're doing a post to a REST endpoint, which is the lists/subscriptions endpoint, and we provide information in JSON format about which list do we want to subscribe, and important. Let me zoom in. It's really important here is this notification URL. So you need to tell SharePoint where your webhook service is living, because SharePoint needs to call out to that endpoint to tell you something happened, remember? So during the subscription time, you provide that endpoint with just a notification URL in our language. And what will happen is that SharePoint will validate whether your endpoint, your notification service, is actually alive. So we will do a post to your service, providing a validation token URL parameter, and we expect you, as the owner of the endpoint, to return that validation token value, which is a GUID. So we want you to return it within less than 5 seconds. This less than 5 seconds rule actually applies to all webhook service calls. So whether this is this validation call or whether it's a real webhook service call made by SharePoint, SharePoint will terminate the connection after 5 seconds. So your implementation always needs to be able to respond in less than 5 seconds. And once that's done, so suppose your service was up and running, you notified SharePoint like, I'm good. At that point, SharePoint will say like, okay, webhook has been created, and will notify you with an HTTP 201 message saying that the webhook is there, and it will provide you an idea around this particular webhook subscription. So
let's kind of reiterate this one. So this is kind of the operation that, hey, SharePoint, I want to have a notification to this web address whenever there's a new item created, as an example. And then SharePoint wants to validate that URL so that it's actually, because it's a push-driven operation from a SharePoint side, it doesn't just randomly want to call URLs which would not be valid. So that's the reason for the validation. And then, like you mentioned, the response within less than 5 seconds, really important thing, and that relates on the operations as well. So if you do have a long-running operation, you need to implement that using an async pattern, which we're probably going to see today as well. So let's talk about that one in the later slides.
Okay. So previous slide explained to you how to get your webhook set up. Everything is set up. You're all ready. At a certain point, let's say you added a webhook to a document library, someone uploads a document to your library. So what will happen? What will happen is that SharePoint will make a call to your webhook endpoint. Now, one important thing to know here is that SharePoint will not immediately make the call. So under the covers, what will happen is that we'll see something happened, so a document was added and to the library. We'll create, we'll store information internally in SharePoint, and there is a timer job running in a short interval, which will kind of see whether there is something to process. And in this case, okay, we have, for example, one document added to your library, and maybe also one has changed. So we see a change for this particular library, and at that point, when the timer job is running, it will pick up that change and will do the notification to you. So it means that you can have notification like a few minutes after the actual event. So something that you need to take in account when you design your usage of webhooks. What we will send you is also interesting to have a look at. We're sending you the subscription ID, which is your webhook subscription. Very important, we're sending you the resource ID and the web ID as well. So resource is actually your library, your list. Web ID is the web where the change, where it happened, where the list is living. So we're not sending you information around like, oh, this particular document was added or this document was deleted, or no, we're just saying you something happened in this particular place, in this library, which is completely different compared to the classic remote event receivers.
True. So you're not actually getting the details on a file name or an item name or the properties which have been changed. You're just getting an ID that something has happened.
You just get notified like something happened for this library. You are expected to respond like, okay, I accepted this notification. If you do not respond in 5 seconds, we will retry. So there's a baked-in retry mechanism. So we keep on retrying a number of times. If your service is still not up by then, eventually the event will not fire. But at least we will try to notify your service, and we'll have kind of an incremental backup strategy there as well. Okay, so remember, SharePoint called out your service, and we told you like something happened in this library. Now, how do you deal with that? What do you do? first step, let's switch to an asynchronous model, as Vesa already mentioned previously, because we're going to process this webhook notification, but we don't know what happened actually. We only know like something happened for this library, but maybe someone did a bulk upload and pushed 1,000 documents in there. And most likely your webhook implementation code can't handle that in less than 5 seconds. So the safest way is to switch to an asynchronous model, and with Azure, using a storage queue is one way to do so. So we essentially put the message we get from SharePoint in the storage queue and respond SharePoint like, we're good, we processed your notification, so we acknowledge we got it. Once it's inside the storage queue, you need to act upon the messages in the queue. So an easy way to do so is using Azure Web Jobs, which can automatically monitor the queue and get triggered when there's something in the queue. And then the clue here is let's use the get changes CSOM API. So with the get changes API, essentially you're going to the library saying like, dear library, what happened with you? What are the changes you got from this particular point in time? Give me all the complete list of changes. So if there would be one document added, you get one change. If there would be a bulk upload of 1,000 documents combined with 500 additions, you get 1,500 change events. And then in your web job, you can process all the change events in the right order. At that point, it can also take longer than 5 seconds. It can take the necessary time that you need to process the change.
Few things kind of a mention on this one, and I think just the process that changes obviously will happen based on the changes what you're getting. Obviously, the web job is an optional thing. You could actually replace that with an Azure function as well. That's one option, and there could be alternative ways of processing the storage queue. But the web job is kind of a classic way to do that because you can queue up and the web job to get executed immediately when the message is added on the storage queue. Super useful scenario. Same applies actually for Azure Functions. To get changes, technically it doesn't have to be a CSOM API as long as it's a remote API. It could be a REST API.
Could be a REST call as well, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
But that's really needed to get to, okay, so what has actually happened? I got the IDs, I got the identities, so what has happened within this list? So.
Yep, just coming back on Azure Functions, you could use a Node.js with JavaScript in an Azure function and then use need to get changes REST API to build something which is not using CSOM at all, which is not using C# at all. That's definitely an option. Okay, now this slide might be a little bit complicated, but we're going to walk over it step by step. But essentially, it gives you an enterprise-ready get changes pattern to handle webhook notifications. So going back to the first step, we're going to create a webhook, which we described earlier on. Now, when we do that, we're also going to grab the current change token from the list we subscribe to. So we need to have this current change token, which we're going to persist, because later on, when we ask the changes, we're going to ask the changes as of that particular moment in time when we made the subscription, which is identified by the current change token. Yeah,
because we don't want to have changes from years back. We want to have changes since the last execution. Absolutely makes sense.
This is the most easiest model, I think, to implement. Otherwise, you would always have to deal with the potential of processing the same change again and again and again, which you could build logic around that, but I think it's easier to just grab the correct set of changes. So you have to persist it somewhere, like in a SQL Azure database, for example. Then when SharePoint calls your endpoint because the change happened, you persist the change in the queue, like we discussed. There's the web job that is then processing the change. But in this case, the web job will grab the latest change token from the database. So when the web job runs, it only gets the changes which were not processed before. Because after the web job did its thing, after you called to get changes and processed all of them, you simply persist the used change token, the last used change token that you got, back into the database. So next time, you only get the changes as of this processing. which is a clean model to deal with get changes in SharePoint.
Sure.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's move to Azure Functions. Why do we want to highlight this? Because Azure Functions is really an intuitive and easy way for you to host your SharePoint webhook notification service. So this screenshot is showing the Azure Function development environment. It's in the browser. You can use any language. Well, probably any is a little bit too broad, but you can use C#, JavaScript, PowerShell, common languages to write your notification service and inside the browser. And with Azure Functions, Azure is the one that essentially is hosting it for you and also scaling it for you. So you don't really need to worry about that. What I really like around Azure Functions is it makes developing the function easier, because it is by design hosted on the internet and available for SharePoint. So you can kind of do some live debugging with it, which we'll show in the demo. You can, for example, validate your function. If you look at the right side here, there is a built-in test console inside the UI, where you can, in this case, I added the validation token parameter. Remember that we needed to validate, when you make a subscription, you need to respond with the validation token that you get from SharePoint. So you can easily try that. You just add a parameter, specify some value, a GUID, and hit on the run button, and you will see in the log like, okay, my webhook was triggered and this happened. So really powerful way to develop and test your webhook services. One thing to notice here is that Azure Functions are available in a free way, just like Azure App Services are. But in this case, then you're bound to a timeout of 5 minutes. So if your function would need to run beyond 5 minutes, it would time out. If you have a paid version and you flip on the always on switch in your Azure web application settings, then your function can keep on running. And just to kind of think about the broader picture, so this function that you see on screenshot, and the one we will also show in the demo coming up soon, is essentially accepting the call from SharePoint. So your notification from SharePoint is accepted by the function, and then it's persisted in a queue, in a storage queue. So we're not processing the actual queue inside this function. So we're using the asynchronous model with an Azure function. So we get the message, we put it in a storage queue, and then we say SharePoint, we're done. So consider this as the first function. Now you could write a second function that is listening on that queue. So a function can be triggered by a message in a queue. Just like a web shop can be triggered by a message inside a queue, also a function can be triggered. So imagine you building a second function, which then is triggered by the message in the queue and does a processing. And the reason why we need the two functions is because simply the first one needs to respond in 5 seconds. So there is no real way to do all the work in 5 seconds, because you can have multiple changes.
So this is pretty much the exact same thing as we explained on the previous slide, the enterprise-ready pattern for handling the things, adding in a queue, and then the code is though in the same location, which is kind of neat as well.
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense.
Same pattern, but then using Azure Functions instead of using an Azure Web Job and a regular Azure Web application.
Yep.
Okay, lots of theory. Now let's switch to a demo. All right, welcome to this demo. I'm gonna first of all start with showing you the application. So I'm gonna refresh the screen, so we're all good. So this is an Azure AD application that essentially allows you to, for a given site, to manage your webhooks. So in this case, I already have one webhook subscription for one list called for the documents list. But this application allows me to add additional webhooks to additional libraries that I have in this particular site collection. Now, before I'm gonna add a new webhook, I'm gonna switch to the Azure Functions screen, because in this demo I'm gonna combine the Azure AD application with Azure Functions, which are hosting the webhooks. So I have one Azure Function host over here called PnP Functions. If you don't have a function host yet, the easiest way to do so is click on the plus. Sorry, click here. Go to Marketplace, New, and you search on Function App. I think it was Function App. Yes. And then you can create a new Function App from here. So I'm going to go back to my pre-created PnP Functions function app. And once it's loaded, I'm going to go to this SharePoint Webhook Azure AD function demo. Long name, but yeah. And it already has the code, and the code is available for you as well. I'm going to talk about that soon. But what I want to show you is the logs. So it has built-in logging. So I'm gonna open the logs. Can I make them bigger? Expand. And let's clear them. All right. So logs are clear. The function is hosted in Azure. Now back to my sample application, and let's create a webhook for. Let's take the site pages, for example, the site pages library. I'm going to hit create. So now SharePoint goes to my webhook notification service. I need to respond to it. I'm good. And then once that happens, the webhook will be created. So this seemed to work, and we should see that also in our log. And yes, we do. So we clearly see that our function was triggered. We received from SharePoint the GUID as validation token, and we responded with that GUID, and the function ended successfully. But this is why I love Azure Functions, because it really makes you see immediately the feedback. So it's pretty cool. Okay, so this one is ready. Let's see if we can then have SharePoint trigger our webhook. So here is the site, webhook demo, and I'm going to go to the documents library, for which I already pre-created a webhook. Let's upload a document. PnP rocks, yay!
Yay, it does.
Yay, it does. So the document has been uploaded, and you might expect to immediately see something popping up here, but it isn't, because again, SharePoint is processing this as a timer job. So it will do whenever the timer job runs. So this can take up to 5 minutes before the actual event is fired and before we see action happening. So while we wait for this, let's show a little bit of source code. Well, actually, let's first show some the place where you can find the demo. So this demo is called webhooks.list.azure.ad, and it is an Azure AD application, which you can find in the SP Dev samples repository. We also have the same demo in a classical, let's call it classic SharePoint, classic SharePoint provider hosted add-in application. So if you go to samples, webhooks.list is a similar application, but then this is a provider hosted application. And what else here?
And there was, by the way, a Node.js implementation for webhooks as well in the sample section.
There is also a webhooks.node.js one over here. Correct.
Yes.
Just pointing out that there is an extensive deployment guide. So if you want to play around with webhooks, this guide shows you all the steps to implement this reference sample. It contains all the Azure AD steps in all details. It explains also how to set up the Azure AD application. If I scroll down, so you get the complete Azure AD application setup. Everything is there.
And the easiest way always to learn is by doing it by yourself, I would say, because then you get the hands-on feeling on, hey, that's how it works actually. Okay, got it.
Yes, absolutely. A little bit of code. Let's zoom in at the right side. So 3 projects. We have the UI, which is the Azure AD application. We have our webhook implementation. And we have a common library, utility library, which contains all the common shared across those 2 projects. What's specific here is because this is an Azure AD application, and we are using regular SharePoint REST APIs and CSOM. We need to have a way to transform the Azure AD login information, your Azure AD session, to a SharePoint client context object, and for that we have this context provider helper class, which has in this case in the home controller, which is the one driving the screen, we have a get web application client context method, which essentially is using PnP. So we're using the PnP authentication manager class to transform your Azure AD web application context to a SharePoint client context. So this is running under your user context, like that's the provisions you have as user. However, when you are in your webhook, at that point there is no user context anymore. So how can that webhook, that code running in a webhook, go to SharePoint? Because it needs to do the get changes called to SharePoint. So it needs to authenticate against SharePoint Online. For that, we essentially have implemented the app-only scenario with Azure AD. So to do so, you connect a certificate to your Azure AD application and then provide that certificate later on to Azure AD to authenticate. That's kind of how the Azure AD app-only flow works. Luckily, PnP again can help you here. So I now switch to the change manager class, which is in the Webhooks common project, where we grab a client context object to do the webhook processing. So this is the web job that runs, and then it doesn't have a user context. So it uses the get app only client context method. Here we see again that we're using the authentication manager class from PnP. This time we're using the get Azure AD app only authenticated context, which is using a certificate to get a valid client context. So these are 2 things you need to be aware of when you create Azure AD applications versus SharePoint provider hosted add-ins. But as said, the code is available on GitHub. There's extensive documentation how to set up things. So the easiest way for you to learn this is grab the code, deploy it, and play around. Let's see, Vesa, if in the meanwhile our
I think it
service was called, and it looks like it was called. So I see in my logs that the webhook was triggered. SharePoint Trader webhook, great. I see the payload, so you see the message that SharePoint sent to you, which contains subscription ID, the resource, which is the list, etc. And then in the code, what will happen is we will deserialize the JSON, and then we'll kind of create individual messages in the queue per change. So this happens, so which then also should mean that we have some action in our site. So going back to the site, going back to my over here. So the implementation we have, essentially when there is a change and it's processed, it will log a message inside this webhook history list. So if I go over here, I see that these two I did before the demo, just to verify that things are running fine. But this is the last one. So we had a new one, change type add. So essentially it's just telling you that this document was added and the webhook notified you about it, which proves that it all works. Not the most sexy results, I think, but it's showing that it does work.
It's a flow. It's a flow what we're going through. Can you actually show the get changes implementation, just to kind of clarify that one still? That's in a web job, right?
Yes.
So when an item goes to the storage queue, it fires the web job, and then the web job is processing the item.
Yeah. So that's inside it's run by the webhook, correct? And the code is inside the shared class in the common in the change manager class. So here we have our process notification. So we create a client context. Here's some processing, but here's the interesting part. It's the region, grab the list changes and do something with them. So essentially, we do a change query, and we're gonna below here we're executing the change queries. Change queries have to be executed in a loop, because depending on the amount of changes, you will need to run it once, twice, three times, whatever, because the results are kind of coming back in batches. So all of this logic is implemented in this reference implementation. But at the end of this, you will have a set of changes, which you can then process. So here, at the very end, we have our changes, which can be many, or just one. But then the do work is the one where we do our great demo, essentially adding an item in the history list. But at this point, your implementation would be here.
Exactly. Exactly. So the key point, what you're getting from the get changes, is that you're getting the change type, you're getting the item details, you're getting all of that. So you could access that item again and do modifications, or if we deleted an item, we get a notification on that one as well, if we associated all of these things in a webhook. So then it's up to the business logic. What are we doing here? That's really the key point.
Yes.
Cool.
All right. I'm going to switch back to slides. And let's do a few closing slides. Let's clarify also what's the difference between webhooks versus remote event receivers. So webhooks, they have a retry mechanism. So if your endpoint is not listening, we will retry, but we don't keep on retrying forever. Keep that in mind. So it's always a best practice to have your endpoints listening or have them deployed on Azure in a redundant way so that they always are available. Compared to remote event receivers, webhooks are less taxing for your service endpoint, because we call them less, essentially, because we're batching changes. If you upload 100 documents, we only send you one notification. Second is that the payload that we sent you, you saw the message, the JSON, it's peanuts. It's just a few bytes of data that you get. Which also means that they're more secure, because we're not sending any specific context about the change. So if someone would sniff the data, it wouldn't give them any value.
Yeah, even though it's an SSL endpoint.
Yeah, that in theory that's. But yeah. Still slightly more
you never
secure.
Know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Webhooks are more easier to consume, because it's a regular and to consume and to develop by non-SharePoint developers, because it's regular HTTP services. So you saw the demo with Azure Functions with C#, but for the same, we could have also used Node.js with JavaScript and Azure Functions, or Python, or whatever you want. It's totally not bound to the SharePoint way of doing things. So you can just write your service in anything that you want.
Cool.
All right. It might be initially maybe challenging to debug your service because the service needs to be available on the internet because SharePoint wants to call it. With Azure Functions, I think you have an easy way to do so. So you will have the live feedback in the debug log, which will make your life easier. If you do not use Azure Functions, and you just deployed it to Azure, what I typically do is just connect remote debugger in Azure. If you deploy a debug build to Azure and then remote debugging, it really works great nowadays with Azure. So perfect opportunity. And a third option is using the ngrok service, which essentially allows you to kind of have your service running localhost, which is connected to a public endpoint provided by ngrok. And this way, SharePoint calls ngrok, which then tunnels the request to your localhost service endpoint where it will hit the breakpoint, for example. So 3 options to debug and develop your service. So you should be good for doing that.
Yep.
Here is an extensive list of resources. It's showing the generic What Are Webhooks article, but a lot of SharePoint webhook links to the documentation, but also to the samples. Webhooks is not just SharePoint, it's in OneDrive and in Outlook as well. So if you're interested in those, we have some links for you as well.
Yeah.
But with that, I think, Vesa, we can close this webcast.
Absolutely. And then there's the one thing that I noticed on this slide, which is always bothering me.
Oh, yeah, I know.
Yeah, the year is wrong. Anyway, great webcast. Thank you, Bert, on the thing. I really think the webhooks is the future of SharePoint eventing. And right now they are GA'd in the SharePoint Online. And we're looking into on-premises story at some point as well, and everything else will make announcements as we move along, depending on when you're watching the video, obviously, what's the status. But I think Bert and I, we're absolutely encouraging people to have a look on the samples, what we're providing, run through the samples to get a basic feeling of this is how it actually works. This particular sample, awesome documentation, step by step, this is how you set it up. It also shows the Microsoft Azure Functions side of the story as well. So great stuff available for you to take advantage. Anything else, Bert?
Yeah, just one thing. If you try it out and you have questions, concerns, feedback, just let us know using the regular PnP channels, creating an issue in the repository, or using the social channels to reach out to us. So we'd love to know how the sample works for you and what can be improved potentially. Yes,
what else would be needed to help people get started on this kind of implementations? Absolutely. But okay, cool. I think that's it. Thank you, Bert, from my behalf. Great presentation and great demo.
Yep. Thank you too, Vesa. Thanks for the tough questions.
Cheers.
Cool. All right. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.